Very impressive, Agrippa. Your victory was decisive. It was in the Emperor's glory, Commissar Holt.
I love the Warhammer 40k universe. It's grim and dark, but also somehow preposterous and silly at the same time. It's a great setting with a lot of possibility, but it's also one that hasn't always translated particularly well to video games. There's no denying that there's a few absolute wonders out there, but there are also reams and reams of below average releases that were certainly not worth the ticket price. But mediocrity is not on the agenda for today. Hi, I'm Caliban, and it's time to talk about Final Liberation, a turn-based strategy game that does a great job of capturing that tabletop feeling. Created by Holistic Design and published by Strategy Legends SSI, Final Liberation first arrived on our shelves 28 years ago on the 20th of November 1997. It was of special interest to me, as I was one of those teens who had spent a lot of time painting tiny blue men, and I relished the idea of enjoying the world of 40k without the usual accompanying superglued fingers or proximity of neckbeards. When I wasn't playing strategy games on my PC, I was playing games on a tabletop, and although I occasionally branched out into a few others like Battletech and Car Wars, Warhammer was always the gold standard for me. My fascination with the hobby ran deep. I had fantasy forces, 40k armies and epic titans, as well as a selection of Necromunda gangs and Gorka Morka vehicles. One of my first ever jobs was staff at a Games Workshop store. I didn't last long there. I was a bad sales assistant, and I spent far too much time talking to customers instead of trying to flog them boxes of stuff they didn't really want. I was also pretty bad at painting. When my store had to submit some miniatures for the entire Ultramarines chapter exhibition that was to be displayed at Games Day, I was only allowed to do the spray undercoating. But I loved it all, so you can understand why the first proper strategy video game set in the 40k universe had both my curiosity and my attention. So now that we've established my total inability to provide an unbiased and objective evaluation, let's talk about how this lovely slice of 97 presented itself. You're immediately launched into a live action cutscene. A hapless soul is interrogated by some sort of orcish machine, and then a planetary invasion commences. You see, Final Liberation is a turn-based strategy game based on a turn-based strategy game. Now that's a pretty simple premise if ever I heard one. Armies consist of a mixture of infantry, vehicles and giant war machines, armed with a wide assortment of weaponry, ranging from the mundane missiles and cannons to sci-fi staples like lasers and particle beams. Each player takes a turn to direct their forces, with the base mechanics being simple yet effective, and pretty much everything uses the same playbook. Units have a movement attribute, which represents how many tiles it can traverse in a turn. Different terrain tiles have different costs, so easy terrain is 1 move, more difficult terrain is 2, and so on and so on. If it uses no more than half of its movement points, it can attack with all of its weapons. If it doesn't move at all, it can attack twice. There are of course a few minor variations. Artillery can generally either move or shoot and only gets to attack the once. And it's not always a fight to the death. The victory point system means that games often end while there's still forces on the battlefield. Every player starts with a morale value determined by the total value of its starting forces. Killing units or forcing them to flee reduces this, and if it reaches 0, all is lost. There's also a couple of objective markers on each battlefield that represent a key strong point or other point of interest. Capturing and holding these results in your opponent losing a small number of morale points at the start of each round. In longer battles, these become very important, so capturing and holding them really makes a difference, especially in the campaign mode where you want to keep losses to an absolute minimum. I'm not quite sure how the attack system works under the hood, but essentially you pick a target that's within range and line of sight and you blast away. You've got a % chance to hit based on the range and quality of the attacker, and a % chance to do damage based on the strength of the weapon and the protection provided by the recipient's armour. Behind the scenes some dice are rolled, and if the Omnissiah be praised, then the offending target is summarily exploded. There's a fair amount of detail in these attack mechanics. Vehicles generally have different armour values on different sides, so the direction of facing is particularly important. Some weapons are better against certain targets than others, and some of the bigger and badder machines can absorb several hits before they're either reduced in combat power or destroyed. Infantry are pretty weak against anything other than light vehicles or other infantry and are low on the mobility side, but they soak up anti-armour weapons pretty well, and you've also got the ability to entrench them, which makes them a bit more resilient overall. You can also mount them in transport vehicles, but these vehicles tend to be paper thin, and a single shot can easily turn them and anything mounted inside them into a big fireball. However, if used carefully, mounted infantry can quickly seize and hold objectives, so they still have their uses. Most of the tanks and other armoured fighting vehicles pack a lot of firepower, but are generally far better at dealing damage than they are at absorbing it. Some of the super heavies, such as the Shadow Sword and the Titans, are a lot sturdier, but you still have to exercise a certain degree of caution with their positioning and movement. It's one of those games where you really do have to think about range and line of sight a lot, and a cautious but thoughtful approach where you expose your units to the absolute minimum of return fire is very much rewarded. An additional reason for a careful approach is the Overwatch system. Units that did not use all of their attacks on your turn may use those attacks on your opponent's turn. If a unit takes an action within range and line of sight of an Overwatch unit, that unit will automatically engage it with the first available weapon. You don't get any say in the matter, and you can't hold your Overwatch for a more tempting target, but it's an effective tactic that can be very fruitful if you can encourage enemy units to move into your kill zones. But it does cut both ways, and sending your strongest units forward unsupported can result in them being suddenly annihilated by hidden enemies before they even get a chance to return fire, even if it is your turn. What's nice about all of these basics is they come together to create a simple system that still has a reasonable amount of depth. Things get a little more complicated when things like flyers and some of the weird and wacky weapons get involved, but generally there isn't too much to learn. The game's bread and butter is a persistent campaign mode set on the planet of Volistad. Orcs have invaded, and it's your job to take back the planet region by region. This starts as an assault by the Ultramarines, who clear you a beachhead, and then the job is handed over to the Imperial Guard, who must slog from battleground to battleground doing the hard graft. This first mission is actually considered to be the tutorial, but you wouldn't know it unless you put your brain in old game mode. The game itself provides no information whatsoever. You have to pick up the manual, flick through the pages until you get to the tutorial section and read the guide enclosed. On the campaign map, units are represented by regiments, which are subdivided into companies and detachments. Regiments are your main game pieces which you can move around the planetary map. If you move them into an enemy-occupied sector, then a battle commences, and if you're victorious, then the territory becomes yours. Each of these territories is worth a number of resource points, and at the start of each campaign turn you're awarded a stash of points equaling the sum of the values of all of your territories. At the start of a game, this is a pittance, but further into the campaign it can be quite a lot and allow you to make some really serious purchases. You start the game with a single regiment. You can't buy any more, but you do unlock a few additional regiments on the capturing of certain special territories. What you can do is buy additional companies for these regiments, and also additional detachments for these new companies. It works on a card-based system, with each company supporting up to 4 detachment cards. Major Hadrian's company has 2 slots that can support any Mordian infantry unit, 1 slot that supports a vehicle card, and a final one that supports either a regular vehicle card or a super heavy vehicle. The more expensive companies provide better options, and each one of our campaign regiments can support a total of 4 companies for a maximum of 16 unit cards. The persistent system does mean that you have to be pretty careful in your gameplay. Individual elements of a detachment that are lost can be replaced by paying half of their purchase cost, but if the detachment is completely destroyed then you can only replace it by paying the full cost again. If 2 vehicles out of a squad of 3 are destroyed, perhaps it's time to retreat the survivor and tuck him safely behind a building or a hill. These considerations really do affect your in-game decision making, and why this is very much a strategy game rather than simply a tactical one. Between each of these campaign missions is a lovely bit of FMV. Sometimes this is just a bit of filler, some eye candy to reward you for a job well done. Other times it's a furthering of the story, as under the ever watchful eye of Commissar Holt, you're guided from battle to battle and towards your final objective. It's worth noting what an absolute treat these cutscenes were at the time. Full motion video was nothing new in '97 for a game, but it was still pretty rare to see it done in such high quality. It looks very grainy today due to the super lossy compression used at the time, but it featured actors, costumes and sets, as well as a decent amount of noteworthy CGI. What really made it stand out was the fact it was probably the first time we had ever seen anything from the Warhammer 40k universe really brought to life. Over the last 20 years we've had reels of video game cutscenes, a terrible movie, and plenty of fan projects of varying quality to show us how our beloved Grimdark warriors would move and fight in the flesh. But back in 1997, I don't think this had ever been attempted before, and Final Liberation gave us something genuinely new. The assorted briefings and cutscenes add up to about 30 minutes of footage and really do an excellent job at fleshing out the game. Some of them are situational and only show up if you capture a certain territory or meet some special criteria, which does give them a slightly dynamic feel too. The icing on top of all of this is the soundtrack, which, like the FMV, is absolutely excellent. Again, with so little pre-existing franchise media, we had no preconceptions about the kind of backing that was appropriate for this universe, but Final Liberation absolutely nailed it. It's some sort of fusion between British heavy metal, orchestral and a touch of the Wild West, and perfectly frames the setting and the battlegrounds you're operating in. As well as the flagship campaign mode, there's a skirmish mode where you can set up predefined battles. This is actually great fun, as it really lets you experiment with a lot of the units that you could never afford on a normal campaign playthrough. You see, on beginner difficulty the campaign is very manageable, but when you ramp it up, the computer opponent gets bonuses to its dice rolls, making for a very unforgiving experience. On top of this difficulty setting, there's a bit of automatic scaling that provides you with matchups of similar sizes to your forces. However, the morale and victory point system generally means that the more units you field, the easier time you're going to have of it. There was also multiplayer support, both in terms of hot seating as well as network and direct play. Not modes I spent that much time in, but perfectly serviceable for the time, and I always find the inclusion of a hot seat option to be a welcome, if not somewhat archaic, addition. Final Liberation succeeds on two levels, both as a turn-based strategy game and as a Warhammer 40k game. In regards to the first, it's mechanically competent, fun and reasonably challenging. The art is perfectly suitable for the time, and all of the individual units are detailed enough to be distinctive but simple enough to avoid clutter. Animations are pretty much non-existent, but because of this it's hard to describe them as bad. I think absent is probably a more suitable judgment, and though it would have been great to have all of these tiny treasures beautifully moving around, I don't think the lack of it really ruins the gameplay at all. There are a few bits here and there, especially on the massive walkers, but they certainly aren't anything to write home about. Thankfully, the gameplay itself is engaging enough that this doesn't really matter. It's the same with the interface. It's not great and it could have really used some hotkeys and shortcuts, but thankfully the game is good enough that this remains a minor background frustration rather than a constant annoyance. As a Warhammer 40k game, specifically an epic 40k game, Final Liberation really ticks all of the boxes, and it's quite easy to see why. If you're going to bring a turn-based tabletop game onto the PC, making it into a turn-based strategy game is one of the most straightforward adaptations possible. It's not a carbon copy of the epic 40k rules, but it does provide a suitable representation of them, and it certainly does a good job of recreating that tabletop feeling. Things move and shoot in a way that you would expect. Victory points matter, and long runs of missed shots bring about the same levels of despair frequently found in long runs of terrible dice rolls. The thing that really makes it shine for a tabletop fan is the ability to play with so many different units without having to spend a small fortune and countless evenings labouring away with a paintbrush. Us hobbyists love that, but we also love taking a break from it, and Final Liberation provides that break in spectacular fashion. It's very clear that this game was a labour of love from those working at Holistic. They weren't just developers, they were Warhammer fans through and through, and really cared about their subject matter. Unfortunately, I think the game suffered from a degree of overrun, and the time and budget required outstripped what was available. There are certainly some rough edges, the odd bug, and plenty of indications that further work was planned but never completed. They initially intended to create an expansion. The in-game codex has placeholders for Chaos, Tyranids and Elder, so we can be reasonably sure that these represent future ambition. Unfortunately, it never came to pass. Reception to the game was mixed at best, and although it was pretty popular with 40k fans, the feeling wasn't widespread. RTS was the new kid on the block, turn-based strategy was temporarily on the back burner, and the basic graphics, although pretty competent, didn't exactly provide the wow factor that would have brought a lot of outside interest. I think basing the game on epic 40k rather than the regular 40k system was an absolutely inspired choice. Warhammer 40k is not a game of large battles. There are only so many 28mm miniatures you can fit on a tabletop, and the average game is generally limited to a few infantry squads and a smattering of vehicles and other supporting units. Tabletop 40k armies are armies in name only, and most forces fielded are company sized at best. With its 6mm scale, Epic really did let you field a whole army, and unlike a tabletop game, the computer is perfectly suited to making all of those moves, dice rolls and rulebook queries for you in a fraction of the time. Final Liberation could never replace the tabletop game for an Epic 40k fan, but it did provide a great companion for it. I also love the design decision to leave the Space Marines mostly on the sidelines. They are the big ticket item of the 40k universe, but the developers didn't feel the need to build the game around them. They aren't involved in the majority of the fighting, and that's perfectly accurate for the 40k universe. The Space Marines are the Imperium shock troops, the tip of the spear, but the slow, grinding attritional warfare is left to the Imperial Guard. And that's how it is in Final Liberation. It's exactly how it should be, and a clear example of how well the developers understood this universe. Personally, I think Final Liberation got a lot right. It wasn't a perfect game, but it was a really good one. The core gameplay is enjoyable, rewarding and pretty addictive. It really gives you that just one more turn feeling that any good turn-based game should, and outside of the 4X genre, it's probably one of my favourite turn-based strategy games of all time. The combinations of regiments, companies and detachments are almost endless, and the campaign has enough routes to success to enable you to play the thing through several times without feeling like you're retreading too much of the same ground. I recently bought a copy while it was on sale for the paltry price of $3, an absolute bargain if ever I saw one. The game was still fresh in my memory after all of these years, so my goal was just to fire it up, play a few missions just to capture some footage for this video. That was a couple of weeks ago, and I've since played the entire campaign through twice and just made a start on a third outing. Now, if that isn't a testament to a quality game, then I don't know what is.
Lord Commander Militant is fortunate to have you as his right hand in his campaign mode. No living commissar holds more respect. Goodbye, Agrippa. May the Emperor guide you in your quest.
Hi there, thanks for sitting with me as I chose my words with exceptional care. If you enjoyed this video, then click the like button and tell me about your attempts to give the orcs a good kicking in a comment or on the Discord. And as usual, if you want more of this sort of thing, then subscribe to my channel and I hope to see you back soon.